My brother gave me a book called How to Be Less Sensitive. He regretted it when I stopped talking to him. I still remember the day my mother first called me too sensitive. I was 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table with tears streaming down my face after Ryan had broken my science fair project, a meticulously constructed solar system that had taken me weeks to build. The planets lay scattered across the floor, Neptune rolling under the refrigerator while Saturn's rings were crushed beyond repair. It was an accident, my mother said, with a sigh, not even bothering to scold Ryan as he stood in the doorway, a baseball glove still on his hand. You're being too sensitive, Alex. He didn't mean it. But I had seen the look in Ryan's eyes just before he accidentally bumped into my table. I had noticed how his mouth quirked into that familiar half-smile that always appeared whenever he got away with something. At 9 years old, my brother had already mastered the art of plausible deniability. That was the first time I heard those words, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. Too sensitive became my unofficial family title, an unwanted label that seemed to explain away every tear, every protest, every time I dared to express that something felt unfair. Ryan, meanwhile, collected different labels: strong, rational, level-headed. My parents beamed with pride at every baseball trophy, every A on his report card, every time he handled things like a man by swallowing his emotions. By the time I was 12 and he was 14, the contrast between us couldn't have been more stark. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" Dad would ask whenever I expressed disappointment or hurt. Ryan never complains. What they didn't see was Ryan behind closed doors, the calculated way he wielded words like weapons, knowing exactly what to say to make me doubt myself. "You're such a crybaby," he'd whisper when no one else could hear. No wonder Mom and Dad like me better. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. Our parents did have a preference, and it was evident in 1,000 small ways. The larger portions at dinner, the brand new sports equipment while I got hand-me-downs, the way they leaned forward when Ryan spoke but checked their watches when it was my turn to share. During my freshman year of high school, I joined the debate team, hoping to finally find a place where my voice mattered. I spent hours researching, crafting arguments, practicing delivery. When I won my first tournament, I raced home, trophy in hand, heart pounding with excitement. "Mom, Dad, I won," I announced, bursting through the front door. The living room was crowded with relatives I hadn't expected, apparently gathered for an impromptu celebration of Ryan's acceptance to the varsity football team. My mother glanced at my trophy, gave a distracted smile, and said, "That's nice, dear. Put it in your room and come congratulate your brother." I stood there, trophy suddenly heavy in my hands, as Ryan accepted handshakes and backslaps from our uncles. My father's arm draped proudly across his shoulders. No one asked about my tournament. No one wanted to hear my prepared arguments or how I'd stood my ground against seniors with years more experience. That night, I cried into my pillow, trying to muffle the sound so Ryan wouldn't hear from his room across the hall and mock me for it later. I wondered what was wrong with me, why I couldn't just be stronger, less affected by everything. Maybe they were right, maybe I was the problem. By the time we reached college age, the patterns were set in stone. Ryan secured a football scholarship to our father's alma mater, and the celebration lasted an entire weekend. When I received a partial academic scholarship to study literature at a well-respected university, my parents seemed more concerned about the portion I'd need to cover with student loans. "Are you sure that's practical?" my father asked, frowning as he reviewed the financial aid package. English literature doesn't exactly lead to high-paying jobs. Meanwhile, Ryan declared a business major, despite barely maintaining the GPA required for his athletic scholarship. "Now that's thinking ahead," Dad approved, clapping him on the shoulder. Ryan's got his eye on the future. College brought distance, literal and emotional, that felt like my first real breath of air after years of drowning. Away from my family's constant comparisons, I began to make friends who didn't think my empathy was a weakness. My poetry professor praised my emotional intelligence, calling it the foundation of compelling writing. For the first time, I started to wonder if being sensitive wasn't a flaw but a different kind of strength. But holidays and family gatherings would inevitably pull me back into old dynamics. Ryan, now captain of his college football team and president of a fraternity, had only grown more confident in his golden child status. At Thanksgiving my junior year, I made the mistake of mentioning an article I'd published in the university literary magazine. That's cute, Ryan said, serving himself a second helping of turkey before I'd even received my first plate. But I've got some real news. Coach says I might have a shot at getting drafted next year. The table erupted in excitement. Questions about teams, potential salaries, and what cities he might end up in dominated the entire meal. My mother actually cried at the prospect of her son going pro. I always knew you were destined for greatness, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. I sat silently, pushing food around my plate, wondering if I would ever do anything that would make them react that way about me. The familiar ache of invisibility settled in my chest, a feeling I'd known for so long it almost felt like home. Later that night, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen as I came downstairs for water. Ryan's going to make something of himself, my father said proudly. He's got that drive, that backbone. And Alex? My mother asked. Her voice lowered. There was a pause before my father responded. Alex feels too much. That's always been the problem. The real world isn't kind to people like that. I froze on the stairs, the words settling like stones in my stomach. It wasn't just that they preferred Ryan. They actually saw my core personality as fundamentally flawed, something that would prevent me from ever succeeding. Something that made me less. I crept back upstairs without getting my water, curled into bed, and stared at the ceiling, allowing the tears to come. But this time, something different stirred beneath the hurt. A quiet anger, a small spark of defiance. Maybe I did feel too much. Maybe the world wasn't designed for people like me. But for the first time, I wondered if that said more about the world than it did about me. Little did I know then that years later, this same sensitivity they mocked would save me in ways none of us could have imagined, and that Ryan's golden child facade would crumble when faced with real adversity. But at 20 years old, lying in my childhood bedroom, all I knew was that I couldn't keep living as the family disappointment. Something would have to change. I just didn't realize yet that the change would need to start with me. 3 years after college graduation, I had managed to secure an entry-level position at a small publishing house in the city. It wasn't glamorous, mostly proofreading manuscripts and fetching coffee for senior editors, but it was a foot in the door of an industry I loved. Ryan, meanwhile, hadn't been drafted but landed a high-paying sales job at a tech company through one of Dad's connections. Mom insisted on hosting monthly family brunches, what she called keeping the family bond strong. In reality, these gatherings had become showcases for Ryan's latest achievements. His new apartment, his promotion, the expensive watch his boss had given him as a performance bonus. That Sunday in May started no differently. The table was set with Mom's best china, mimosas were flowing, and Ryan was holding court, describing his recent business trip to San Francisco. So then the client says, "If you can close this deal today, we'll add another $50K to the contract." Ryan laughed, swirling his mimosa. You should have seen the other guy's face when I pulled out the paperwork I'd already prepared. Another commission in the bag. That's my boy, Dad beamed, clapping Ryan on the shoulder. Always thinking 3 thirps ahead. I smiled politely, pushing my eggs around on my plate. I'd recently edited a manuscript that had received positive feedback from the publishing director, a small victory, but one I was proud of. I waited for a pause in Ryan's monologue to share my news. I actually had a good week too, I ventured when Ryan stopped to take a bite of his avocado toast. Remember that manuscript I mentioned last month? The director thinks it has potential. Oh, before I forget, Ryan interrupted, reaching for a gift bag beside his chair. I got you something, Alex. Surprised, I accepted the package. Ryan rarely brought me gifts unless it was my birthday or Christmas. What's the occasion? Just saw it and thought of you, he said, a familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Open it. The table fell silent as I pulled out a hardcover book wrapped in tissue paper. As I turned it over to read the title, my stomach dropped. How to Be Less Sensitive, a Guide to Toughening Up in a Harsh World. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The gold-embossed letters seemed to blur before my eyes. Ryan laughed first, followed by Dad's hearty chuckle. Mom tried to hide her smile behind her napkin. Even Aunt Carol, who I'd always thought was on my side, let out a little snort. Ryan? Mom scolded half-heartedly. That's not nice. But her eyes were crinkled with amusement, and Dad was still chuckling. What? Ryan held up his hands in mock innocence. It's a bestseller. I'm trying to help. Alex is always getting upset about something. I forced my face into what I hoped was a neutral expression. Thanks, I said, setting the book aside with hands I prayed weren't visibly shaking. Very thoughtful. Chapter 3 is especially good, Ryan added, forking a piece of bacon. It's about how people who take everything personally sabotage their own success. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't focus on anything being said. The book sat beside my plate like a grenade with its pin pulled. Every few minutes, someone would glance at it and stifle another laugh. Dad picked it up at one point, flipping through the pages. You know there's some solid advice in here, he said, as if he were recommending a healthy exercise routine rather than endorsing the systematic dismantling of my personality. I excused myself to use the bathroom, locked the door, and pressed my forehead against the cool mirror. My reflection stared back, eyes bright with unshed tears. I refused to cry here, where they might see the evidence and consider it further proof of my problem. In that moment, something crystallized within me, a realization that no matter what I achieved, no matter how I grew, my family would never see me differently. In their eyes, I would always be defective, needing to be fixed. The hurt ran so deep, it transformed into something else entirely. Resolve. I returned to the table, smiled through dessert, and even laughed when Ryan made another joke about getting me a sensitivity support group for Christmas. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The book hadn't just hurt me. It had broken something I couldn't repair. Or perhaps it had broken something that needed breaking. That night, after driving home to my small apartment, I placed the book on my coffee table and stared at it for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and searched for therapists in my area. I found one specializing in family dynamics and booked an appointment for the very next day. I didn't tear the book to pieces or throw it against the wall. Instead, I placed it on my bookshelf, spine out, where I would see it every day, not as a guide to follow, but as a reminder of the decision I made that night. I would no longer explain myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I set my phone on Do Not Disturb, blocking the family group chat notifications. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. And strangely, in that quiet apartment, with only the distant sound of city traffic for company, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. My therapist, Dr. Landry, had a small office with plants in every corner and a box of tissues always within reach. During our first session, she asked me to describe my family dynamics. By the time I finished explaining the book Incident, the tissue box was half empty. What strikes me, she said, leaning forward in her chair, is not just how they treat you, but how you've internalized their narratives about yourself. Over the next few months, I learned about emotional boundaries, family roles, and how sensitivity could actually be a strength rather than a weakness. Landry called it emotional intelligence and explained how people with high emotional intelligence often make excellent leaders, writers, and creators. Your family has taught you to see your natural empathy as a flaw, she explained. What if you reframed it as your superpower instead? I didn't make any grand announcements about distancing myself from my family. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful declarations. Instead, I simply began a quiet retreat. When the next family brunch invitation came via text, I replied, "Can't make it this month, work deadline." It wasn't even a lie. I had volunteered for weekend editing projects specifically to have a valid excuse. My mother called that evening. "You're missing Ryan's big announcement," she said, disappointment evident in her voice. "What announcement?" I asked, despite myself. "He's been put in charge of the entire West Coast sales division. At only 28, your father is beside himself with pride." "That's great," I said flatly. "Please congratulate him for me." "You could tell him yourself if you came to brunch," she pointed out. "I told you, I have work." The silence on the line spoke volumes. Work had never been an acceptable excuse before. Family always came first in our household. But something in my tone must have indicated this wasn't up for negotiation. "Well," she finally said, "I'll let everyone know you're busy." I could practically see her putting busy in air quotes, implying my work couldn't possibly be as important as Ryan's moment in the spotlight. In the past, I would have backpedaled, apologized, or even rearranged my schedule to accommodate them. This time, I simply ended the call with a pleasant, "Thanks for understanding." Over the next few months, I declined more invitations than I accepted. I responded to family group chat messages hours or even days later, offering brief, polite replies rather than the detailed updates I used to provide. When I did attend family gatherings, I arrived late and left early, citing work or other commitments. No one confronted me directly about the change. Perhaps they didn't notice, or perhaps they were relieved not to have to manage my sensitivity anymore. Ryan made a few passive-aggressive comments about my mysterious new life, but when I didn't rise to the bait, he quickly lost interest. Meanwhile, I poured my energy into building that new life. I enrolled in a creative writing workshop, where my emotional depth was considered an asset rather than a liability. I applied for a junior editor position at my publishing house and got it, earning a modest but meaningful pay raise. I moved to a slightly bigger apartment in a neighborhood I loved, decorating it precisely how I wanted without worrying about anyone else's opinion. Most importantly, I made new friends, people who didn't know me as the sensitive one or Ryan's sibling. My workshop group evolved into a tight-knit circle that met weekly for coffee and critique sessions. Elena, a poet with a piercing laugh, became my closest confidant. Marcus, a sci-fi writer who worked as a nurse by day, introduced me to his hospital friends. Suddenly, my social calendar filled with events I actually looked forward to: gallery openings, book launches, trivia nights at local bars. For the first time, I felt seen for who I actually was, not who others thought I should be. My sensitivity, the very trait my family had ridiculed, made me an exceptional editor and a loyal friend. When Elena went through a difficult breakup, I knew exactly what to say and when to simply listen. When Marcus's manuscript was rejected for the third time, I helped him revise it until it shone. "You have this way of understanding exactly what people need," Elena told me one evening as we walked home from a reading. "It's like a superpower." Dr. Landry had been right. What my family had labeled a weakness was actually my greatest strength. 6 months into my quiet separation, I realized I hadn't spoken to Ryan in over a month. He hadn't noticed my gradual disappearance from his life, too wrapped up in his own success story to see that a chapter was missing. Our parents occasionally mentioned him during our increasingly brief phone conversations. Another promotion, a new luxury car, a glamorous vacation, but I found myself caring less and less about the golden child's gilded life. When I finally muted the family group chat entirely, no one even texted to ask why I wasn't responding anymore. At first, the silence was painful, an acknowledgement of how peripheral I'd always been to my family's story. But as weeks turned into months, the silence became peaceful, then powerful. I was writing my own narrative now, one where my voice was finally the loudest in the room. And in this new story, I wasn't too sensitive. I was exactly as sensitive as I needed to be. 2 years passed in what felt like both an instant and a lifetime. I had been promoted to associate editor, working with authors whose books actually appeared on shelves rather than in the slush pile. My circle of friends had expanded, and I'd even started dating someone who admired my emotional depth rather than mocking it. My therapist and I had scaled back to monthly sessions, focusing more on career growth than family wounds. I was in an editorial meeting when my phone vibrated with 3 consecutive calls from my mother. I excused myself, stepping into the hallway with a sense of dread. Mom never called repeatedly unless something was wrong. "Alex?" Her voice sounded strange, thin and fragile, nothing like her usual authoritative tone. "Your father's in the hospital. He had a stroke this morning." The world tilted sideways for a moment. Whatever distance I had carefully constructed between myself and my family instantly collapsed. "Is he?" I couldn't finish the question. "He's stable," she said quickly. "The doctors say it was minor, thank goodness." "But Alex, I don't know what to do. There are insurance forms and medication decisions, and they keep asking questions I don't know how to answer." In all my life, I had never heard my mother admit to not knowing something. She had always been the family organizer, the one who handled the practical details while Dad and Ryan focused on big-picture thinking. "I'll catch the next flight," I promised, already mentally rearranging my schedule. "Text me the hospital details." I arrived at the hospital 7 hours later, exhausted from the last-minute flight and the surge of emotions I'd been suppressing during travel. Mom looked smaller somehow, sitting in the waiting room with a stack of forms in her lap. When she saw me, her face crumpled. "Oh, Alex," she whispered as I hugged her. "I'm so glad you're here." Dad was asleep when we entered his room, various monitors beeping steadily beside him. His strong frame seemed diminished against the white hospital sheets. I swallowed hard, realizing how much older he looked than in my memory. "Where's Ryan?" I asked quietly as we stepped back into the hallway. Mom's expression shifted. "He's coming. He had an important meeting he couldn't reschedule." I bit back my immediate reaction that no meeting could possibly be more important than Dad's health crisis, and I nodded. "I'll help with the paperwork." Over the next few hours, I navigated the hospital's bureaucracy, spoke with doctors, arranged for Dad's prescriptions, and set up a schedule for home care after his discharge. Years of meticulous editing had made me good at details, at asking the right questions, at understanding complex information and translating it into actionable steps. Ryan finally arrived at dinner time, his designer suit rumpled, his face unnaturally pale. He took one look at Dad in the hospital bed and had to step out of the room. I found him in the visitor's lounge, head in his hands. "He looked so mortal," Ryan said, without looking up. "I've never seen him vulnerable before." I sat beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "The doctors say he'll recover well with proper care and lifestyle changes." Ryan finally raised his head, and I was startled to see his eyes were red. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "The whole way here, Mom kept texting me questions about insurance and medical proxies. I don't know anything about that stuff." "I've handled it," I said simply. He stared at me, really seeing me for perhaps the first time in years. "How are you so calm right now?" The question hung in the air between us. How could I explain that years of processing my emotions rather than suppressing them had given me the tools to function in a crisis? That my sensitivity, the very quality they had mocked, allowed me to acknowledge my fear for Dad while still taking necessary action. "Someone has to be," I finally said. That night, as Dad slept and Mom dozed in the recliner beside his bed, Ryan and I sat in the hospital cafeteria with bitter coffee and untouched sandwiches. "Mom says you've been distant," he said abruptly. "I hadn't really noticed until I tried call you today and realized I didn't know if you'd changed your number." I hadn't. He simply hadn't called in so long that my contact might as well have been deleted. "I've been building my own life," I replied neutrally. "Yeah, I get that." He stared into his coffee. "Look, I know we haven't really." For someone whose sales career depended on smooth talking, Ryan suddenly seemed at a loss for words. "It's fine," I said, not wanting to watch him struggle. "We're here for Dad now. That's what matters." But Ryan shook his head. "No, it's not fine. When Mom called about Dad, I totally fell apart. Couldn't think straight, couldn't make decisions. Meanwhile, you flew across the country and took charge of everything within minutes." He looked up, his expression revealing a new understanding. "You were always the strong one, weren't you?" "Not me." The admission hung between us, rearranging 30 years of family dynamics in a single sentence. All those years of being labeled too sensitive while Ryan was praised for being strong and rational, and yet, when real crisis struck, our roles had reversed completely. "Feeling deeply doesn't make me weak," I said quietly. "It just makes me human." For once, Ryan didn't have a clever comeback or a dismissive joke. He simply nodded, a small gesture that somehow acknowledged decades of misunderstanding. Dad's recovery meant I stayed in my hometown longer than I had in years. I worked remotely, taking early morning video calls in my childhood bedroom before heading to my parents' house to help with physical therapy appointments and medication management. Ryan took a temporary leave from work, something that seemed to genuinely surprise our mother, and between us we established a caregiving routine. It was strange, occupying the same spaces as Ryan without our usual dynamic. The awkward silence of that hospital cafeteria conversation hung between us, neither fully addressed nor forgotten. He was careful around me now, watching his words, sometimes stopping mid-sentence when he caught himself slipping into old patterns. 2 weeks after Dad's stroke, I found a package outside my hotel room door. Inside was a book, The Power of Emotional Intelligence in Leadership. A note in Ryan's handwriting was tucked inside the cover. "I've been reading about emotional intelligence. Turns out your sensitivity is actually a skill set. They're now teaching to executives. Who knew? I stared at the note for a long time, feelings too complex to name swirling through me. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest Ryan had ever come to acknowledging his misconception of me. The next morning, as we sat together in our parents' kitchen waiting for Dad's physical therapist to arrive, Ryan cleared his throat awkwardly. "Did you get the book?" he asked, eyes fixed on his coffee mug. "I did. Thank you. I've been talking to someone too," he said after a pause. "A therapist, started a few months ago, actually." This surprised me more than anything else could have. Ryan had always ridiculed therapy as something for weak people who can't handle their problems. "That's good," I managed. "Yeah, well," he shifted uncomfortably. "Turns out being the golden child comes with its own issues. Performance anxiety, fear of failure, emotional constipation." Her words, not mine. A ghost of his old smirk appeared, then faded. "She's been helping me understand why I was so hard on you growing up." I waited, letting silence do the work that my questions couldn't. "I was jealous," he finally admitted. "You could feel things so easily, express them so naturally. I was terrified of showing any emotion that wasn't confidence or anger. Even with Dad in the hospital, I couldn't cry until I was alone in my car." "That book you gave me," I said quietly. "The sensitivity one. It really hurt." Ryan winced. "I know. I know now. At the time, I thought I was being helpful in some twisted way." He met my eyes directly. "I gave you that book because I didn't know how to handle emotions, not because you were broken. You never were. I see that now." The apology I'd never expected to hear hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to accept it immediately, to bridge the gap between us and reclaim the closeness we'd never actually had. The deeper, wiser part, the part I'd nurtured during my time away, recognized that forgiveness didn't require forgetting. "Thank you for saying that," I said finally. "It means a lot to hear." "So, we're good?" Ryan asked, relief evident in his voice. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "We're better, but Ryan, I can't go back to how things were. I've built a life that honors who I actually am, not who our family wanted me to be. I won't compromise that, even for reconciliation." His face fell slightly, but he nodded. "I understand. I missed you. I didn't realize how much until you weren't there anymore." Over the next few days, we established a tentative new dynamic. We shared childhood memories without the barbed edges they once carried. Ryan asked genuine questions about my work, my friends, my life in the city. I listened to his stories about the pressure of corporate success and his growing disillusionment with a career built more on our father's expectations than his own desires. As Dad grew stronger and more independent, the time for my departure approached. The night before my flight, Ryan and I took a walk around the neighborhood of our childhood. "Remember when you beat me in that school debate competition?" he asked suddenly. "I was so mad that you were better at something than me that I accidentally spilled soda on your notes before the finals." "I knew that wasn't an accident," I laughed. "I stayed up all night rewriting those cards from memory. And still won," Ryan said, a genuine smile crossing his face. "I should have known then you were tougher than any of us gave you credit for." We reached the park where we'd played as children, now quiet in the evening light. "I wish you weren't leaving," Ryan said softly. "I have to," I replied. "My life is elsewhere now." "I know." He kicked at a pebble on the path. "Can I visit sometime?" The question was tentative, almost childlike in its uncertainty. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. "But Ryan, understand something. I'm not coming back to being the family emotional support system. I care about you all, but my peace isn't up for negotiation anymore." He nodded, slowly. "I'm starting to understand what that means." As we turned back toward home, I felt something settle within me. Not the closure of a wound, exactly, but the knowledge that healing didn't require perfect resolution. Some farewells weren't endings but necessary boundaries, drawn with love rather than resentment. The next morning, as I boarded my flight home to my real home, I carried with me not just the tentative beginnings of a new relationship with Ryan, but the certainty that I could wish him well without sacrificing who I had become. 3 years after my father's stroke, I stood in front of a packed auditorium, heart racing but voice steady as I addressed the audience. "We've been taught that sensitivity is weakness," I said into the microphone. "That to feel deeply is to be fundamentally flawed. Today, I want to challenge that narrative." Behind me, a slideshow displayed the logo of Resonance, the wellness platform I had founded 18 months earlier. What had begun as a blog chronicling my journey from family scapegoat to self-acceptance had evolved into a thriving community for emotionally intelligent individuals, particularly women who had been told they were too sensitive their entire lives. "Sensitivity isn't a defect to overcome," I continued. "It's a strength to harness, the very qualities that may have been dismissed in your childhood. Empathy, emotional awareness, intuition are precisely what the world needs most right now." The irony wasn't lost on me. The book Ryan had given me as a cruel joke had eventually inspired the name of my most popular workshop, How to Be Successfully Sensitive in a Harsh World. I had taken the weapon meant to diminish me and transformed it into a foundation for helping others. After the talk, a line of women waited to speak with me, many clutching copies of my recently published memoir. Each shared a variation of the same story, being labeled as overly emotional, being told to toughen up, being made to feel broken for their natural emotional responses. "Your podcast episode about family dynamics changed my life," one woman told me, tears in her eyes. "It was the first time I understood I wasn't the problem." My podcast, The Strength in Sensitivity, had started as a side project recorded in my apartment closet. Now it regularly appeared in the top charts for personal development content, featuring interviews with psychologists, authors, and other experts on emotional intelligence. As I signed books and chatted with attendees, my phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Caught the live stream of your talk. Impressive stuff. Dad even watched some of it." I smiled slightly, tucking the phone away to respond later. Ryan and I had settled into a new kind of relationship. Not close, exactly, but cordial. He had visited my city twice, and we met for dinner when I returned home for brief visits to check on our parents. Our conversations remained careful, both of us navigating around the tender spots of our shared history. My father's health had improved significantly, though the stroke had left him more reflective and less dogmatic. He'd never directly acknowledged his role in our family's dynamics, but he'd begun to show a tentative interest in my work. Last Christmas, he'd awkwardly mentioned seeing me on a morning talk show. "You spoke well," he'd said, which from him was tantamount to effusive praise. My mother had adapted to the new normal with her characteristic practicality. She forwarded articles about emotional intelligence to me, though I couldn't tell if she recognized the irony. She called weekly with family updates, accepting without complaint when I sometimes let the calls go to voicemail. After the event, I returned to my apartment, a spacious loft in a converted industrial building, walls lined with bookshelves and art created by friends. Alina, now my business partner at Resonance, had left a congratulatory bottle of champagne on my kitchen counter with a note. "Another audience enlightened. Celebrate yourself tonight." I poured a glass and stepped onto my small balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled. Tomorrow, I would fly to Vancouver for a speaking engagement, then record 3 podcast episodes with researchers studying the neurological basis of empathy. My calendar was filled with work I found meaningful, connections that nourished rather than depleted me. My phone buzzed again. An email notification from my editor about the paperback release of my memoir. The cover featured a photograph of the original How to Be Less Sensitive book, its title crossed out and replaced with handwritten text, "How to Be Perfectly Powerfully Sensitive in an Insensitive World." I thought about the journey from that family brunch to this moment, the quiet separation, the rebuilding, the unexpected reconnection on new terms. The path hadn't been linear or easy, but it had been mine to choose. Ryan had called me last week, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I'm thinking about a career change," he'd said. "Something more meaningful, I guess. Would you have time to talk about it when you're in town next month?" "Of course," I'd replied, surprised but pleased by the request. I wouldn't play therapist or emotional caretaker for him. Those boundaries remained firm, but I could listen, could perhaps even guide him toward resources that had helped me. Our relationship would never be what our parents had hoped for, but it was evolving into something more authentic than the roles we'd been assigned in childhood. As I sipped my champagne and watched the stars emerge above the city skyline, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I had once believed that family meant unconditional sacrifice, that love required diminishing myself to fit others' expectations. Now I understood that the truest form of love for others and for oneself involved honoring boundaries, acknowledging hard truths, and sometimes walking away to find your own path. The book that had once made me feel small had ultimately given me the strength to write my own story. And as the thousands of messages from my community proved daily, it was indeed a damn good one. One that helped others find their voices too. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the sensitivity that had been my supposed weakness, but had become my greatest strength. To the pain that had shaped but not defined me. And to the future I had built, word by word, choice by choice, into a life that finally felt like home.